To retire here at the end of June. But I want to welcome you to one of our science and management forums. We started these a couple of years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, the truth be known, to have a little more time to pursue issues in depth, a little more time than, for instance, our Friday night lecture series allows. But issues that were of concern to the Hudson Valley and the state of New York, where we wanted to have a full morning and have a variety of views brought to the table, have a chance for audience participation, questions, and comments, and to be able to leave with some value-added knowledge of the issue. And so we, over the last 2 or 3 years, have pursued these forums on the topics of fracking, groundwater pollution, the use of road salt and alternatives to road salt. Today is one that's been long in planning on sustainable stewardship of the landscape. I really got into ecology in a very strange fashion. I grew up in a completely suburban family with parents that had no interest in the outdoors or whatever concerning the outdoors. But a neighbor down the street was a professional marksman for Remington Arms and hunter. And had no kids, so he kind of adopted me as his project to introduce me to the hunter sportsman approach to nature. And so off we went onto some duck hunting along the shores of Lake Cary and rough grouse hunting in northern Ohio. And I realized that hunters and field naturalists were not all that different. They were both interested in preservation and stewardship of the land. Both developed skills of reading the landscape, of where things could be found, where they occurred, what kinds of signs wildlife left behind. And it struck me that in recent years there's been kind of a separation of conservationists and sportsman hunting community, which I regard as unfortunate. I think we really ought to be talking with the same voice to people that are interested in land preservation, habitat preservation, and its maintenance and stewardship. And so that led in various avenues to Lori Quillen, who you may have met here, has helped me organize these. That's a euphemism. Lori really organizes them, and I take credit for them. Anyhow, Lori and I began to talk about, how would you put together a science and management forum which would bring some real science and experience into the room for land management. And today is the product of that. And we have a couple of scientists from Cary. We have several folks. We're kind of co-sponsoring this with the Dutchess Land Conservancy. So we have good representation from that organization. And some participation from local landowners, including Tim Bonnecue from the Tamarack Preserve just east of town here. So you want to hear from our speakers and not any more from me, because the speakers are where the real content is. And so let me introduce to you our first speaker, Charlie Canham, who's a senior scientist on the Cary Institute staff, has been here for almost the beginning of time when the Institute got organized. He is a student of forest ecology. Charlie and I stem from the same doctoral major professor at Cornell a number of decades ago. I went on into chemistry, Charlie went on into pursuing forest ecology, and has spent a lot of time in his career looking at the processes that determine how forests in the future will look and what they will be composed of. And of course now, as we are faced with climate change and facing the entire region and rapid land use change from population pressures, how our forested landscape will look and how we might manage it for its effective sustainability and preservation is of utmost importance. So without further ado, Charlie Canham. We share the same heritage too.
Thank you, Bill. Is the sound okay? Great. Let's see. Okay, my life consists of sitting in front of the multiple monitors in my office, running banks of 75 computers in the basement of the building next door, processing the millions of records of trees that the U.S. Forest Service collects around the country to try to model what will happen to forests going forward under things like climate change, pests and pathogens, logging, air pollution. But for much of my career, I spent out in the woods when I actually got to go out and measure trees. And I grew up here in the Hudson Valley and got interested in trees by wandering around in the woods, and I would find these old stone foundations with these gigantic trees growing out of them. And it just was, you know, a hint of a world that I just really couldn't understand. And so my role, my job here this morning is to give a historical context to the landscape around us. If there's a simple take-home message, it's that you can't figure out where a forest is going without knowing where it's been. Forests, at least in my mind, the way I think about forests is that they are these giant ships, like the Titanic, maybe headed towards an iceberg. They don't turn very quickly. It takes a lot of time, and if you're going to manage a forest, you need to be very smart about using natural processes and nudging them. Brute force rarely works with natural systems, or at least it's expensive and often ineffective. In contrast to trying to understand what the natural dynamics are and where they might go and how you might nudge them. A lot of forestry, for instance, is involved with thinking about, you know, where those levers are that you can productively use. And so I'm going to really give, you know, this is a much more fun thing to do on a walk in the woods, and that's typically where I do these kinds of talks. And I do it once or twice a year here on the grounds and in other places. But so I'm going to do it in this nice dark room when it's going to be a gorgeous day outside, which seems a little odd, but here we are. So just a couple of disclaimers. I'm not a historian, and there probably are some historians in the room. You know, the towns here in Dutchess County are blessed with some really good local historians, and I draw heavily on their work. But I'm very interested in this. Forests take millennia to really change in many ways, and so without a historical perspective, I'd really be lost. But I'm going to look at this, what's happened in this landscape, from the perspective of a forest ecologist. So, have any of you read what was it, 1491? The anthropologists are reimagining the nature of the New World prior to European contact. When I got here, in the depths of time, which would have been 30 years ago, February, my first job as a postdoc here was to go out and look at the forests here and figure out what we had. If we were going to start a research institute, many of us were going to do work here on the property. We needed to know what was on the landscape, and so my first assignment as a postdoc was to go do a vegetation study of the forest here. And the Cary Arboretum had volunteers. I don't know if any of you were those volunteers. Go back and go to the original deeds for this property and look for the records of what are called witness trees. Have any of you looked at your deeds, gone back, and note that they talk about trees? So the corners of properties were marked by recording what the species of trees were. Now these, as you move to the western U.S., the Midwest, this was regularized in the General Land Office survey of the, you know, when you fly over and you see the square grid of townships and ranges, 1 square mile sections. Every corner of every section in that big chunk of the U.S., 4 trees were recorded at that corner, and actually even halfway along. Here in the Northeast, where the surveys were done very irregularly, they still recorded trees at corners. So that, in fact, is our one really quantitative bit of information about the nature of the landscape prior to European settlement. And of course, what the forests looked like before then is a subject for the early botanical explorers that came through, oral histories from Native Americans. But there's the first really quantitative bit we have is from what are called these witness trees. And they tell a story here on this landscape that the picture would be of essentially unbroken forest. As best we can tell, Indian agriculture was concentrated on the better soils, which, as you all know, if you're from Dutchess County, is about 2% of our land, and mostly along streams, floodplains, or along the rivers. And so our image of the uplands, pretty much everything else, was of one unbroken forest, but dominated almost entirely by oaks. If you look at the bar over there, the blue bar for maples, there were almost no maple trees, either red or sugar or silver. All three of them would have been here, but they were really rare in those witness tree records. And there's no reason to think the surveyors didn't like maples and were biased against them. They just were not common in the landscape. The standard explanation for this is that fire was incredibly ubiquitous in these forests. That oak forests like fire. They burn in the spring. This is our fire season, folks, so that's why, in fact, the burn ban is probably still in effect, isn't it, till May, the DEC? And the fuel for those fires is actually the leaves from these oak trees. And that's what burns in the spring. The snow's gone, it dries out, those oak leaves haven't decomposed, and boom, off the fires run. And they're not, you know, these crown fires that you see pictures of in the West where the whole forest goes out, but they burn along the understory. They open up the forest a little bit. And the oaks have that thick bark and they're quite tolerant. And so we have this image of a fairly open but oak-dominated forest. But very quickly, that landscape changed. These are actually photographs of the Harvard Forest dioramas. If any of you have been to the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts, these are actual physical sort of think of a cubic meter, a cubic yard dioramas. And the trees in there and the people there are little tiny figures made out of metal. They're really quite amazing. They were done in the 30s. And so these are photos. But, you know, here in this far in from the river, it really would have been probably around 1740 or 1750 before the land was being sold off from the Great Nine Partners patent. Settlers were moving in from either the Hudson or the Housatonic, sort of converging on this middle of the county, and starting to carve out these small farms, growing primarily wheat as the cash crop. Wheat really was the basis of the economy here. There's actually Jefferson and Madison did a trip up through the Hudson Valley by carriage. They left from Peekskill and then came on through to inspect the problems with the wheat yield, because by the late 1700s, early 1800s, the wheat crop was failing. Basically, the soils were, as you know, again, I don't want to offend anybody about our soils, but they're horrible. They're thin and stony and infertile until modern agriculture and fertilizer came along. Those first farms had that sort of flush of decent yields, but yields were declining all through the late 1700s. And then the Hessian fly and a rust disease were introduced from Europe, and wheat yields just plummeted. And the Hudson Valley was really the breadbasket for the colonies in the early republic, and so the decline in wheat yield here was a big issue. In fact, you know, as it collapsed, luckily the Erie Canal opened up in 1825, and everybody left. And then actually the plains out south of Rochester along the Great Lakes there became the real wheat producing region for the colonies. But then you had this, you know, basically this period of, you know, so the farms had gone from just very small, few acres of fields to fairly intensive by the early 1800s, and then sort of calamity happens. You know, the wheat yields decline, but really opportunity happens. The Erie Canal opens up and people move to the Ohio Valley, Bill's home country, where there is real soil. And you begin this process of land abandonment. So when we did this first study of the forest here, and we were coring trees to determine the ages of the forest, we sort of have we have forests of three different ages here on the property. We have forests that date exactly from this. Soon after, you know, the Erie Canal opens, people leave, and if you didn't leave, you bought your neighbor's farm, and you kept his best field and your best field, and you let your marginal fields go back to forest. And so, you know, these abandoned farmlands started to regrow the forest, and we have forests on the property that date from about 1825 to 1850, that period in there. We also have forests that date from the late 1870s, or another period of agricultural depressions in the Northeast, and land was again abandoned. And then, again, in the Great Depression of the 20th century, a lot more land abandoned. And so, basically, I live in the town of Clinton. So until the census in 1960, my town hadn't recovered from its pre-Erie Canal population, right? So the town of Clinton peaked in 1820, and then its population declined for the next 100 years through this process of people moving west. And the other thing that was happening, of course, by the late 1800s is that people were moving into the cities, because the wealth coming back from the Erie Canal was being funneled through New York City to be shipped over, all that agricultural produce, hams and grains and so forth, shipping off to Europe. The cities were really building, and so people were either moving into the cities or out west. So we get this period of reestablishment of forests, and a lot of the white pine that became really the mainstay of the economy here in the late 1800s, early 1900s. White pine, the farmers made actually most of their money from their white pines, not from their crops. That was mostly gone as an economic force here by the 1920s, 1930s. White pine is still important. I suspect that Pine Plains, that was probably white pine stands that dated from some hot fires at some point in the past. Does anybody from Pine Plains know that history?
I don't know the history, but I found Pine.
Yeah, it's almost certainly white pine rather than red pine or pitch pine. And pine was really valuable in this landscape, but for this narrow window of time. And then, much like wheat collapsed because of the Hessian fly and the wheat rust, the white pine weevil came in. You see white pines now, and they have that multiple stem that's worthless for timber, and that was from the introduction of an insect that kills the leader of the white pine. White pine blister rust, the reason you can't grow black currants, I guess you can now, but an alternate host for the white pine blister rust. Diseases came in, and pine was harvested out. But underneath the pine, hardwoods were coming in. And so we have this whole landscape that basically, has gone through this bottleneck. So, I've just sort of given rough figures here. Assume that 100% of the county was forested in 1700. The low point, or this is the 1915 number is from a Cornell Cooperative Extension publication. It's actually quite quaint. It's fun. So it talks about, it's a summary of the agricultural resources of Dutchess County. And it points out that 16% of the county is in forest, but that means that 84% of the county is improved. And in fact, the language in this report is that, and this is the way it should be. This is sort of the way God intended Dutchess County. We have done what we should to make this land productive. And that is the way, we as a country thought about these lands. And in fact, to a land manager looking at those abandoned fields, what did we do? Well, we gave everybody red pine seedlings to reforest those abandoned pastures. Unfortunately, we planted monocultures of red pine, which now are all dying from insects and diseases. But it's hard to underestimate the industriousness of sort of the last 200 years of land use change in this landscape. And yet we're now back up to probably 55, probably close to 60. And I have to say, this vignette, this picture of land use change is pretty universal in the eastern U.S., sort of outside of the coastal plain, where the sandy soils of the southeast, where there's still very intensive forestry. It wouldn't quite apply to places like the Hudson Highlands or the Catskills, where it was really more a forestry-based industry, but the valleys all went through this bottleneck where 75, 85% of the forests were cleared, went into some form of agriculture. So for instance, the property in the Canoe Hills behind us here, if you go back through their deeds, they were bought and sold by farmers as woodlots, not necessarily adjacent to their property, but if you had a decent farm, you needed a woodlot, and these lands were constantly being bought and sold among farmers who wanted to have access to the timber on that land. So a small chunk, about a quarter of the Cary Arboretum, because it's so hilly, was never cleared as best we can tell, but it was heavily logged all throughout that period. And so a very intensively used landscape. We do tend to believe that we've sort of peaked. We don't really expect between suburbanization, land clearing for houses and so forth, and frankly a rebirth, a strengthening of agriculture in the county. We think we're probably at about 60% and about where we're going to stay for the foreseeable future, if not, frankly, go down a little bit. So the question is, have the forests recovered? And this is, in some ways, is a marvelous story of sort of the resilience of this landscape. We actually have lovely forests out here. I have to say the forests that are here now have no analog in the last 12,000 years. Remember, there was 2 miles of ice, thick sheet of ice here 12, 13, 14,000 years ago. The glaciers recede. Tree species recolonize the Northeast from the southern U.S. And they go through it, and climate changes constantly throughout that period. We have the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period and the Younger Dryas right at the end of the Ice Age, where temperatures warmed up and then dropped precipitously, stayed cold for another 1,000 years, and then warmed up dramatically. And all through that, the forests were changing in response to that much slower climate change than what we're seeing now, but still climate change. But the mix of species we have in these forests now, there's nothing like it anywhere in that record, right? So we have created a new mix of species on this landscape. And if you go out in these forests here on the Arboretum, there are 3 kinds of forests, and they map completely onto the kinds of land use. We have chestnut oak and red oak dominated forests in the old woodlots. If land was abandoned from a good cultivated field, you get the smaller seeded things like birches and maples, and even we have some tulip tree here and cherry and things like that. If it was a pasture, it came back to oaks, but 2 different species of oaks, white oak and black oak, because farmers liked oak trees out in the pastures. You got some shade and you had acorns for your livestock. And so it's quite likely that those hill slopes that were woodlots with red oak and chestnut oak, that's probably where the red oak and chestnut oak was 500 years ago, because the farmers made decisions about what to do based on the condition of the land. And so the steeper slopes they left in woodlots. But there were, certainly, for instance, those forests are now 50% dominated by maples, and there's no time in the post-glacial history when we see that exact mix. The forests that have come in on these abandoned cultivated fields don't have the oaks at all. And the white oak and black oak, those pastures, we honestly don't really know what exactly would have been there before. But again, there's nothing in the paleo-ecological record that looks exactly like what we have now. So what's missing from these forests? All sorts of things. So these forests go through this bottleneck. So you cut down the trees and you plow the land. The trees come back. What doesn't come back very quickly, if ever, are a lot of the understory herbaceous species, the wildflowers. And a lot of these things are dispersed by ants or touch-me-nots. You touch one and the seeds go, a yard. It takes a long time to recolonize a 1,000-acre area if you're only dispersing a couple of feet a year. And so there are a lot of things missing from the understory. We have all sorts of new things in these forests. I've done a lot of work on the invasive tree species. That's a tree of heaven. It's actually a photo taken right here on this property. Norway maple. 2 of the best postdocs I've ever had. We did some very intensive work on those 2 invasive tree species. And actually the postdocs were quite depressed by the results. The results were that neither of these species is going to take over and dominate our forest, which I thought was wonderful news. But they were depressed because it's much sexier to have a really scary story. It's easier to get published. It was going to be 500 to 1,000 years. Yes, the interesting thing about these forest folks is that the canopy is a zero-sum game. You can only pack so many trees in the canopy. And so both of these species will become more common over time. It's almost certain. And by doing so, they will displace, in relative terms, native species of trees. There will be less sugar maple and more Norway maple. There'll be more tree of heaven and less white ash. Well, there's going to be a lot less white ash for other reasons that Cary will talk about. But the understory, garlic mustard, many of you, do you pull this on your property? This is the easiest thing to pull out in the world. It and honeysuckle both can just be, I have just a tiny patch of forest on my property. And I've managed to pretty much eliminate both of these species just because it's fun. But I actually argue, this gets me in trouble with invasive species programs, but the understory of a forest is not saturated with species. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not at all clear that the presence of garlic mustard in the understory is displacing native species. Now, this is not a message we tend to trumpet. The story with invasive species is we don't do nuance with invasive species. They're bad. We try to control them, but the fact of the matter is you have limited resources and you have to decide where to make your battle. In some ways, even though it's going to be a much slower process for these trees to really take over, as they do, they will displace, in relative abundance terms, native species. It's still not entirely clear that garlic mustard, other than being sort of a rank weed, is going to displace native species in the understory. So what else is new? Well, the funny thing is that actually one of the most famous papers that Bill's my advisor at Cornell, Peter Marks. One of his most famous papers was to ask, we have all these beautiful old fields in this landscape. They're really some of my favorite communities. They're actually some of our most diverse vascular plant communities. Most species, a lot of wildlife that uses these communities. And these are disappearing. These are a product of that very intensive land use history that is gone. This is an artifact of history that is not being repeated now, folks. And these things are disappearing fast because the trees are coming back, which as a forest ecologist I should feel is a good thing. But this is a real big chunk of the diversity of our landscape, and these are disappearing. The interesting thing to ask is, and that Peter Marks asked years ago, was where did these species come from? So a lot of the species in these old fields are non-native. So 30% of the flora of New York is non-native. It's not invasive, it's just naturalized. Settlers brought all sorts of things in the hay in those ships when they came over. Lots of plant species introduced. And then we brought lots of things over for our gardens. But an awful lot of the species in there, little blue stem, the goldenrods, things like that, those are native species. And prior to European agriculture, they were probably incredibly rare. There really wasn't this habitat prior to this sort of wave of agriculture and then abandonment. And they're probably on their way to becoming rare again. Although many of these species have become invasive in other parts of the world. So in Japan, our goldenrod grows 10 feet tall and colonizes abandoned rice paddies. And so, they'll just move somewhere else. I think this is a big issue for us in the valley. There's species like short-eared owls, the New England cottontail. Some of the species that wildlife ecologists are most concerned about are the ones that take advantage of this habitat, and it's disappearing. And so, this is the view, obviously, from Stissing Mountain. And, it's even looking down, there's just more and more forest, and the fields that remain open are more intensively managed, and so there's less and less of that. The other thing that is missing from this landscape, and I alluded to this earlier, is fire. I know that the Mohonk Preserve has been trying to manage fire in their oak forests. Places like the Shawangum Ridge with those pitch pine barrens, they have to have fire or they will disappear. And the Hudson Highlands, they burn pretty regularly. It's hard to put the fires out up there. But pretty much everything outside the building here, all of these forests, probably had light ground fires every 5 to 10 years for thousands of years before basically a couple things happened. Over the last 100 years, we suppressed fires, and then as the maples come in, the maple leaves decompose over the winter because of the chemistry of their leaves, and there's not enough fuel to carry a fire. So many of our forests are hard to burn now. So by suppressing fire for 100 years and letting the maples come in, we've actually created this novel ecosystem that isn't as flammable as it once was, and which is, and probably a good thing if you're worried about, fire in your property. But from the point of view of the oaks, it's pretty widely believed by forest ecologists that oaks are going to decline throughout the eastern U.S. sort of inexorably. In a weird way, climate change might actually benefit them. They like warmer. They tend to be, most of our oaks are at the northern end of their climate ranges, and so climate change could conceivably benefit them slightly. But without fire, these forests go to more shade-tolerant species like the maples. So I just want to say a couple of words about logging. This is really, in the ecological history of the Hudson Valley, logging was really clearing or an activity that was practiced in the highlands, the uplands, the Hudson Highlands or the Catskills. I do a lot of work in the Adirondacks, and so these are pictures from the Adirondacks, mostly from Barbara McMartin's wonderful book. Again, I talked about industriousness. This was industrious. The clearing that was done, by guys with, crosscut saws and horse teams, mostly in the winter, loading logs into rivers and then floating them down into Glens Falls and those places. Really sort of hard to fathom just how much work that was. The story that's closer to home would be the story of the Catskills, which were basically completely clear-cut in the mid-1800s just to strip the bark from the hemlocks to tan leather. Much of the leather for the Union Army came out of the Catskills. As best I can tell, the hides were actually shipped up from Argentina on ships and then taken by cart and train up into the Catskills. So Tannersville was an enormous tannery complex. And you have to wonder what the streams, the Catskill is home to some really world-class trout streams now, the Catskills are, but you have to wonder what these tanneries are doing to those streams for 50, 60 years, dumping all that effluent and just sterilizing those rivers. I've never seen much. But this was, and so hemlock is much less common in the Catskills now than it was prior to that, because hemlock doesn't sprout back the way the oaks and the maples do. So, and then obviously by the late 1800s, early 1900s, as railroads became common, they could start to log the hardwoods. And all I want to say is that there's this perception that forestry is not being practiced in this landscape. And nothing could be further from the truth. And the number I always toss out comes straight out of these Forest Service National Inventory data. 2/3 of the trees that die in the eastern U.S., so this is trees, for me a tree is something bigger than this. If it's smaller than that, it's a sapling. 2/3 of all trees that die in the eastern U.S. die because one of us cut it down, right? So logging accounts for twice as much mortality of trees as all other causes combined. But it's not clear cutting anymore. We're partially harvesting land, and it's that. And Connecticut has the distinction of being one of the first states in the country for its carbon in its forestry sector to actually go negative. Connecticut is being over-harvested by landowners choosing now's the time to log my forest. Prices aren't particularly good right now, but somebody comes in, they take 20, 30% of your trees with one of these mechanized harvesters, and they're gone. And there's really nothing at the landscape scale that's really ensuring that we don't overharvest, and there's enough global demand for our wood. The U.S. is basically a third world nation when it comes to its timber products. We export wood, we don't do something with it here. We sell it to somebody else and then buy it back as furniture. It's my preaching for the morning. But there is an immense amount of forestry going on, and it's not visible to the public, but foresters are incensed by this. A lot of it is not particularly good forestry. It's what we would call high grading. Somebody comes in, offers you money just to take 15, 20% of your trees, but they're just going to take the best trees. They're not going to do anything to make sure you get good regeneration. We've got a lot of deer, which we will talk about, which makes this even harder. So there are some big issues. And then this is just a lead-in to Gary's talk later. But there are other threats to these forests, and you can do the best forestry you want, and you still have to be willing to cope with the emergence of things like emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, an insect that northern range limit is literally right outside my office window. I do a lot of work on these. Gary does. We do a lot of research on these here at the Institute. It's this just gradual loss of species over the last 100 years. I used to think that there was something unique about eastern U.S. forests that made them vulnerable to this, but this is now happening worldwide. We're sending insects and diseases over to other parts of the world. Species are being damaged. Beech, one of my favorite trees. It's not true you have to have a gray beard to be a forest ecologist, but a surprising number of them do have. And we have cases like this right near Tea House Hill. Beech is one of the most widely distributed trees in eastern North America. It grows from Nova Scotia to the highlands of Mexico, and was one of the most important trees for many species of wildlife in the north because of its hard mast, its seeds. Not a particularly valuable tree from a timber point of view, but and foresters actually don't tend to like it because it sprouts pretty heavily. But this disease was introduced from Nova Scotia in the 1890s and is spreading just inexorably, and it leaves in its wake a very devastated and unproductive forest. So Gary will cover that in much more detail. So, the lesson here is that we've created this new world, and I actually do not want to try to create the impression that we've lost something. I think we've actually created something quite marvelous. This landscape in many ways is more diverse than it was prior to European settlement. Maybe they're all weeds, but they count as species to me. And so, I don't think this is a bad thing, but it does, and so a little more preaching, I apologize. But, we know we have incredible power, and so I think many people sort of look to the past as a guide for what you should try to manage for, and I'm not entirely sure that's viable anymore. There are too many things going on out there. We've got, deer densities that have probably never been present in this landscape. We've got all these new invasive species. We've got air pollution. We've got climate change. And so the notion that we could manage to get back to what was here, frankly, we would have to reintroduce fire in a way that it's just inconceivable in this landscape. Yes, in a large enough piece of land with an enormous amount of money, you could try to reintroduce fire. I serve on the board of one of the Nature Conservancy chapters in the state, the Adirondack chapter, and I'm embarrassed to say we've abandoned some preserves because that were pine barrens up in the northern part of the state, because we cannot get the local fire chief to ever let us burn it. You know, just sort of the politics of fire are really tricky. And so I don't see us going back, and so I think, I don't have an awful lot of concrete recommendations, but I think what this means is that you have a lot of freedom to try to think about the science, understand what's possible, and then figure out what's practical and what you want to achieve with your land. And so I'll stop there and take
You suggested at the beginning that there were perhaps gentle nudges that could be helpful. Are there some that you might mention?
Well, the gentle nudges. Don't clean up after storms. Okay? Humans love neatness. I mean, everyone except teenagers. And so we have these storms, and your first impression is, I got to get out there and I got to clean up all that debris on the ground. And it's exactly the wrong thing to do. That dead wood on the ground serves all sorts of important ecological functions. I have neighbors who rake the leaves out of their forests each fall to try to make it look like Central Park. Well, 15% of the potassium in that forest is being cycled through those leaves every year. It's sort of like cutting the cake into smaller and smaller pieces, but you're going to be in trouble if you do that every year, right? You're removing nutrients that way. And so, that's the one that I'm on a bit of a hobby horse on. It's just the urge to clean up after nature is just an enormous human tendency, and I do it. Actually, I need to get my chainsaw fixed, actually. And so, but that's the one I want to, sorry, I better stop because I'll say other silly things.
There's a history of losing trees like the chestnuts. Yeah. People are trying to bring it back. You see this list of trees that are endangered today. What's the replacement?
Well, unfortunately, not unfortunately. Red maple is the most common tree in eastern North America. Sugar maple is the second most common tree in eastern North America. Red maple is actually valuable now. I mean, you can make furniture out of it. It used to only be sold for pallets. It was worthless as a commercial species. It's got the broadest ecological tolerance of any tree species. It can grow in swamps, it can grow on ridge tops. And so we're getting, calling it weedy is not, sugar maple is my favorite tree. I did my PhD on the ecology of sugar maple at Beach. But we're getting down to a list of species. So the risk is that we're getting down to fewer and fewer species. So the Asian longhorn beetle, those are its two favorite food plants. So if the Asian longhorn beetle ever got fully escaped from Worcester, it's just shown up in central Ohio at an old abandoned tractor supply parts place. So if something shows up that takes maples, we're in real trouble. But basically what happens is the trees that aren't currently being devastated by a pest or pathogen just fill in its space. And so we're just getting fewer and fewer, we're getting lower and lower diversity. Ailanthus and Norway maple would both take advantage of that, the death of ashes, for instance. But yeah, we're just getting a less and less diverse system.
Take one more.
Okay.
It's not a forestry question, but about the herbaceous invasive perennials. The last couple of years, Japanese stiltgrass has taken over the mustard is going, and is that just
Well, you know, the funny thing is that we are just north of a whole bunch of really nasty invasives. And I don't understand. You go down to Long Island or even down to Westchester, New Jersey, southern Connecticut, and you've got, you know, Smile, Greenbrier, all sorts of things. Stiltgrass is just getting here.
Yeah,
so are we?
Orange County.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
And I don't understand. Our soils are really that. Orange County actually has some decent soil. Well, most of them are still in agriculture, but I'm not entirely sure why. Whether it's just a matter of time. And so my nonchalance about garlic mustard is probably not going to persist. I'm going to, you know, I think these things are very tough to stop. Most of them are pretty thoroughly established, and it's really hard to slow their spread. Biological control is probably our only good tool. That's one. That gets back to this first question. Finding a biological control for pests and pathogens or invasive species is really where most of the research is going, because the mechanical means or the chemical means are just too expensive and have problems of their own. So.
Apropos of Charlie's comment, I couldn't help but think that when Lisa and I moved up from North Carolina 7 years ago and moved into our house, I decided that in the village of Millbrook that the yard was much too neat and had been raked